Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this video is we're going to be looking at the inquiry process, which is basically the process of asking questions. Now, why would you be asking questions? Well, you'd be asking questions for the sheer sake of basically interpreting and analyzing and understanding a text. Okay, so what we're going to go through is we're going to look through basically the various methods which you can use to help, first of all, search for the kinds of text, or search text for detail that you'll need, and you'll be trying to add insight and strengthen your responses as well. So those are the two things that you're going to be trying to do, is find detail and also add insight and strengthen what it is you're discussing. Now, the inquiry process basically involves the following questions: who, what, when, where, why, and no prizes for guessing. Next question is how. Now, those questions are basically ones that you'll be probably very familiar with, first of all. And second of all, these are questions which are basically forming the inquiry process. Not saying that they were limited and completely restricted to those exact questions, but they're a starting point for basically the things that you need to do when it comes to interpreting a text. As in, ask these sorts of questions and you will find your answers. Alright, and don't just ask them once, ask them a number of times. And continue to go down different streams until you do find that insight that's going to strengthen your response, or find the right kind of detail which is going to help you support it. So basically the purpose of this process is to ask plenty of follow-up questions and to ask these sorts of questions about a text. And as I mentioned, these are basically done so you're able to interpret it. Now, when you're interpreting it and when you're going through the process of basically, first of all, just asking questions, you're really developing an insight and understanding through the various questions that you ask. Now, the simple answers to these questions are fine. In fact, I would expect one-word answers to start with. What's this saying? This. Okay. The next question, you continue on with that. You only really add detail on the idea that you get at the end. Okay, so if you say, why did he cross the road to get to the other side? Why did he want to go to the other side? He needed milk. Why did he need milk? Because he wanted breakfast. Why does he need breakfast? Because he needs to basically start his day well. So putting it all back together, breakfast is needed to... He needed to cross the road in order to start his day, or something like that, okay? So that's the sort of insight that you get on the end, and then you can add insight or something based on that. Okay, so that process of walking across the road to start your day, to get the things that you need to start your day, is a sort of an insight more than just crossing a road is, all right? It's a bit of a silly one, don't ignore that. But it's one of those things that once you find more complicated examples in the text, you'll find that this is a lot more helpful. And certainly you can practice doing it in sort of silly ways like that, but it's one way that you really do help get insight, as well as research. Research is basically the most useful thing that you can do during this process. It will give you a lot more background information, and it will give you a lot more where you can source your sorts of questions from. In other words, you'll be basically sourcing a number of different questions, and you'll be thinking about a number of different possible answers to those questions based on the research that you've done. Okay, so it will give you a bit of a background and will help to validate some of your answers if you're not sure of them. Alright, so the first thing to do when you're starting to this process is never do it on the first read-through or the first viewing. Okay, because if you're asking questions, you may find the answers already somewhere later on in the text. So there's no point doing it while you're actually reading it or viewing it. So don't ask questions at that point. Just sit back, read, watch, enjoy the ride. Wait until later to basically go through and do this process. Go back to the parts you thought were important to the construction of meaning after you've read it. So what stood out to you? And then ask questions about, why did it stand out? How did it stand out? What part? Why did that part stand out? Okay, what purpose does that have? What insight is that giving me? What sort of theme is it representing? What, who, when, why? You ask lots of questions. It might sound silly at first. Might sound silly if you say it aloud, but the thing is, you're getting the answers out of it. And you're basically being able to get something where probably before you were looked at and going, so really, it might sound silly, and it might sort of, especially if you do say it out loud, I wouldn't recommend saying it out loud like I just did then, but the more you do it, the easier it gets, and certainly if you sort of keep asking those sorts of questions, you will get the insight that you need. You only need to really look at small sections, okay? Don't do this to the entire book because it will take, or a film, because it will take you forever. All right, find sections that are important, climactic sections, sections from beginning, middle, and end, wherever you get them from. Look for small sections and really interrogate those. Really ask what it's trying to say. And try to cover an even spread of the text. So don't just ask questions of one section and go, I'm done. Because if you just cover one section, you're going to be answering one section of the text. If you do it from a couple of different sections, you're more likely to cover a lot more of it than if you just do one. Okay, so if you just cover the end and you just say, well, that's the end, I'm done, let's go watch TV, you're not really going to get any insight out of it. And certainly you're probably not even going to get an accurate answer. So you need to be looking at lots of different sections, and you need to be looking at them across an even spread. But of course, most of all, you're looking for things that stand out first and foremost. All right. So let's look at this in action. And I want you to have a very close look at that image there. Okay. Family sitting at table. What's this an image of? Well, it's a 1950s-ish American family at the dinner table praying before their meal. Now what we're doing in this for this image is we're looking for insight, what this image is representing to us. Now, yes, you could just say on a simplistic level that it is a 1950s American family at the dinner table, but really if you're inquiring about it and if you're asking for insight about it, then you need to go a lot deeper than that. And certainly if you're asked a question about what is this image representing, I mean, anyone could tell you this. They're not going to look for you just to describe what you see. They're going to look for what this actually represents symbolically. And especially if you're asked what it represents symbolically, then, okay, there are lots of things that it represents symbolically. So we've got to sort of keep asking questions until we find one, and a deep one as well. Okay, so we start with that they're an American family in 1950s sitting at the dinner table praying before their meal. Who are they? Well, they're white. They are presumably husband, wife, and 3 children, middle class, and I put in brackets or in commas there, typical. Now, typical is not a normal word that you would use to describe something like this. You might think it's typical, and it probably is, but you wouldn't describe that in an English setting. And the reason why you wouldn't describe it as an English setting is because typical requires a definition. And by typical, you've got to go into extra depth and describe why it is typical, okay? And what it's typical of. And you'll have to do a whole heap of research just to justify that one word that you've put in there. In other words, just get rid of it and just say it is a white American middle-class family with 3 children, a husband and a wife. Easy. All right. So through this image, we get basically a view of white America middle class. Why is it typical? Okay. In this case, we are going to explore that word typical a little bit. Well, it reflects many other images of the era, stereotypical view of the American public at home. Now, just because I wouldn't write necessarily about this point, doesn't mean that I can't ask questions about it, because it may give you insight in other ways. In this case, that's what we've done, okay, because we've gone through typical and seen, okay, how can we discuss it in other ways? Well, it reflects other images as a stereotypical view of the American family. So we've got something that we can start with and say, well, yes, it's symbolic of a stereotypical view of the American family at home. I think we can go even deeper than that, though, and really discuss it on a much deeper level and a much more holistic level. Okay, but does it truly represent those things? Okay, well, for many, it probably does not. It does not take into account other ethnicities. So if you're just describing it as a sort of typical American family, well, that's not a typical American family because it doesn't take into account others, all right? Now, yes, you could say that typical does sort of represent the majority and not necessarily one type or the other, but I'm sure most American families wouldn't necessarily see themselves in that image, all right? It does not take into account other ethnicities, and particularly if you're looking at modern America, if you're looking at modern Australia, that's not a modern representation of Australian values as much as it is American values. And it's a quite simplistic representation. Just to say, well, it's a stereotype. Well, yeah, okay, but what else is it? What else could it possibly suggest? What else could it imply? Okay, what does it imply? It's an idealization of what American life is. So not necessarily a stereotype, but how Americans want to see themselves. So in other words, Americans want to see themselves as clean, God-fearing, polite, well-fed, prosperous individuals who have a good life, who have a safe life, have a happy life. That's an idyllic way of looking at things. And that is what this inquiry basically is leading us. So it's not so much an image of the American family, it's an image of how the American family wants to see themselves. It's almost too clean, it's almost too picturesque. Okay, and you can justify that. You can justify it by the way everything's laid out, by the way that the kids are all immaculately dressed, that there's nothing on the floor, that the husband's in a suit, that the wife is in her fine clothing, that everything is perfectly and perfectly set up. There's almost zero flaws in this image, right? Apart from perhaps the decor at the time. So ultimately where we lead ourselves is a tokenistic view of the pure and wholesome American family. So one which is not really real. It's very fake, this image. And it's trying to represent an ideal view of Americans as being basically pure and wholesome. Ones who, as I said, pray to God before having their meal. Who live in a very clean and safe household. All those things together basically leads us away and goes much deeper. Is a much deeper representation than just simply, oh, they're just an American family. Okay, well, sure. But this represents it a lot more deeply. It represents it, I guess you could say, cynically. But more importantly, it represents it in a much more interesting sort of way. As by even just saying it's a stereotype, well, talking about stereotypes isn't necessarily the most interesting response you can give to this image. Whereas with this one, you're actually really going deeply into it. It still represents it as a stereotype as well, but you've got it as a much deeper understanding of it and a much deeper understanding of what it represents. Okay, so we do have that now. We have an insight into what this image represents. But we're not finished yet. You might be going, oh my God, what do I do now? Well, the thing is, you've got to keep doing this process. You've got to ask more questions about the techniques, the themes, the characters, and the context. As well as, I guess, how it's represented as well. But we have found a little bit about how this image is represented and what it uses, okay? It represents something else, and it's not representing that necessarily directly. All right. Now, you might be going, well, that process took us, 10 minutes? I haven't got a watch on, but you get the effect. Okay, how long is this going to take me? Well, it's not going to have to necessarily take you long, all right? You could also look at other aspects of American culture this image could represent as well. So not only can you look at those questions, you can look at other alternatives. You can go into lateral thinking mode or another type of thinking, okay? So you don't necessarily even have to do it the most literal and direct way. Now, the quicker you practice it, the quicker you're able to do it. All right, and that's the point I was going to make before, which is that if you think, oh my God, this is going to take me forever, I'm going to have to do this over and over and over again, and it's going to take hours, the more you practice this skill, the much quicker you can do it. Okay, you can do it much, much quicker. So that interpretation for someone who is skilled would probably only take about 30 seconds to a minute of just asking those questions. You'd be able to basically do a very quick series of questions in your head and then get something that will give you that sort of an answer. And it won't take you too long at all. And if you do that to certain parts of the text, then you're going to have deeper insight, and it's going to take you all of maybe half an hour to an hour of a little bit of investigation into it to find a couple of very deep answers. If you, of course, you want to keep doing it, keep going comprehensively, then you keep finding sections that you can discuss and explore that really do represent what the text is about. But obviously the main thing is to practice. The more your knowledge of a text grows as well, you'll feel more comfortable with this process. Okay, so you really need to know the text first. And that involves that research process at the start. That involves basically learning a bit about the context of that text. And it basically means that you need to really get to know it before you start that process. Okay, so don't just do it off no reading or no understanding of the text whatsoever, but actually read a couple of times or watch it a couple of times. Really get to know it and really understand what it is it's trying to say. Okay, so in summary, you start by asking questions. It's the heart of what the inquiry process is all about. In fact, it's what the inquiry process is named for. You continue with follow-up questions. So you keep asking more questions. And you basically go until you find some sort of insight, something that you go, wow, that really does represent it. That's really quite deep. I can talk about it, and it really gives me a very strong answer to the question that I've been asked. Now, of course, this is the main thing that we've got to look at here, is the inquiry process is only going to give you insights. It's going to give you ideas. It's going to give you the truth about what the text is really representing. The other thing that you need to be wary of course, is a question. A question is not going to ask necessarily for that insight that you've just chosen. So you need to choose the right kinds of insights to represent. But of course, this process is just a research process. It's about really finding answers first. We're not asking questions just yet for that reason, because really one of the most important things you can do is start to look for answers to answer different types of questions. Now, this process, you may find that you've done 3 or 4 investigations into a text to find something that is not going to be covered by a question you may be asked. And that's quite common. In which case, you can't just use all the stuff that you've just done because it's not going to be relevant to the question. What you've got to do is you've got to find another answer to it by doing the exact same process. It might seem tedious. It might seem like you're wasting a lot of effort. But ultimately, that's what you need to do in English. You need to actually have answers for all types of questions. You need to be prepared for a multitude of questions, and you need to prepare things that you may not necessarily have to use. All right, so that's the main part of what the inquiry process does. Make sure that you are very selective of the detail that you use, and make sure that you really do look for insights wherever you can about what the text is genuinely trying to represent, and try and do it on a deep or really complex level. Actually give yourself a complex idea or point that you can discuss, and really discuss it in depth. Otherwise, that's it for the inquiry process. So until next time, I'll see you later.